right, everybody, let's do this. I am Drew McManus, the author of Adaptistration, and this is my podcast, Shop Talk, where I invite captivating guests to talk about engaging topics connected to the orchestra business. Today, I've got two captivating guests, the first of which is making her second appearance on the podcast, Ceci Dadisman. Ceci has more than 15 years' experience working with arts organizations of all sizes and disciplines. She's a frequent public speaker at industry events and also teaches arts marketing at West Virginia University. Currently, she is the marketing director at a real estate tech startup. Hello, Ceci.
Hi, Drew. Hi, Mark.
Hey there.
And Mr. Haydair is Marc Van Bree. Marc is a solutions-driven marketer backed by 15 plus years of results converting online and offline. He's experienced in building marketing infrastructures and creating, managing, and finessing campaigns. He currently serves as the Director of Partner Marketing at ShipStation, and before that served as the Director of Marketing at the Austin Opera and the Public Relations Coordinator turned publicist at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Fun fact, he has the distinction of being the very first member of the CSO's marketing team that was dedicated to managing the organization's social media platforms. So while he doesn't look like he's that old, he really is that old. Hello, Marc. How are you?
Hi. I am healthy considering my age. You know.
It's the Dutch genes. They work. Yeah. They do wonders.
Right.
Well, let's see. Today's topic is we're going to talk about something that doesn't usually get hit on in these sort of conversations inside the field, but we all know what attrition is like in the business, but attrition goes one of two paths. Someone can attrition from one arts organization to another arts organization, or they can attrition out entirely into the commercial sector. Both Ceci and Marc are two individuals that I've spent a lot of time with. We've actually done conference sessions together on Google Analytics and all kinds of fun marketing stuff. And I have a substantial amount of respect for both of these professionals here today. But they've both also taken the path of going from established arts organization positions of leadership and have moved into the commercial sector. And they've both been very successful where they are now. And I brought them on today because what I want to talk about is the things that we can learn from both sides of the fence. You know, people in the commercial side love to say how great it is to have artists and people who work in arts organizations because they're creative and so on and so forth. And people on the arts organization side love to talk about how they can be more professional because apparently they're not. It's a self-esteem issue. But the reality is somewhere between the two. You know, there are positives and negatives, but you don't really know what those positives and negatives are until you've really lived inside both of those organizations. And so both of these individuals have, I think, a reasonable amount of time in both sides of this fence. So, you know, let's kind of kick things off from there. Marc, I think you were the first one to kind of like move into the commercial sector of between you and Ceci. So bring us up to speed. What was that like? Going through that process, what was the decision you made where you said, okay, I'm going to actually strongly consider something outside the field?
Sure. Well, the decision to look elsewhere was involuntarily. I, the opera in Austin was having trouble. This was 2012. And so the position was eliminated or downgraded really to a marketing manager position. So I was really forced to look elsewhere. And, I looked at other arts organizations, had some interviews at other arts organizations, but really decided that this was the time to move to a more commercial setting, a more corporate setting. I think I kind of went halfway because I really started at a startup, which I would say, that's maybe almost like a halfway path between corporate and nonprofit.
We have the halfway house startup.
Right. So they took this lost soul in, But no, it was definitely an interesting experience because it's so very different in many ways, but also so very similar in many ways. You know, it's a lot of nuances. It's almost like, you know, I'm from another country, and you know, while it's a Western country, the Netherlands, it's people always asking me what's the difference between living here and living in the Netherlands, and it's all in the nuances, right? It's both Western cultures. There's so many similarities, but it's all in the nuances, and I think the same thing for nonprofit versus corporate or startup. It's all in those little nuances, I think. So that's kind of where it happened. From there, I moved to a really kind of bigger corporate structure, which was something to get used to, and then now my position is backed by a large corporate structure, but then acts as a little bit more of a startup, although I shouldn't say startup anymore, because now they're at, like, you know, 500 or plus people in just that division, right? So yeah, you know, it would be a very large arts organization at this point.
Nuances. I love that phrase because my mind immediately goes to that opening scene in Pulp Fiction. And they're talking about the differences when Jules was overseas in the Netherlands, you know, being a drug dealer and a smuggler, I suppose, at that point in time. But the little differences. You can buy a glass of beer at the movie theater. Yeah, and I think that's a great way to kind of describe, yeah, it's similar, but there are differences, but it's not the same. Ceci, your path was not really all that dissimilar because it was kind of like a stepping stone to where you're at now, correct?
Yeah. And a lot of people were surprised when I made the shift because, you know, especially in the last few years with all the speaking and consulting and all of those things, you know, my entire identity was wrapped up. It still sort of is in working with arts organizations. And, you know, I was the poster child for supporting, empowering, you know, arts administrators and all this stuff. But, you know, I had an opportunity to get out of the industry. I had been thinking about it for some time. You know, as everyone knows, being an arts admin is not for the faint of heart. And, you know, when I had the opportunity to move on to something else, I took it. So it was, you know, it wasn't like it was on a whim, but, you know, there was some time there to get used to the idea and some positions, and this one worked out.
Let's talk stigma with that, because I think you touched on something that a lot of arts administrators feel, which is the personal identity. And because being an arts administrator is not an easy gig, you know, there will be tears, that kind of a job. You also take a weird sort of pride by being somebody who shouldered those responsibilities and went through that nonsense and came out the other side. And, you know, were those thoughts that went through either of your head that, you know, I may have this stigma of being someone who leaves and doesn't stick with it and keep fighting the good fight sort of thing?
You know, it's interesting. I've been thinking about kind of the move to corporate, and you know, I would almost say the opposite. That it wasn't oh, I gave up, I didn't stick with it. It was almost to be honest, it was almost a, man, I shouldn't have started out with it. I shouldn't have started out in the arts. And
hindsight. Nope.
You know, I mean, looking at it, it's like, you know, where would I have been in a corporate career had I not started there? You know, looking at kind of peers that maybe went through the same college program and where are they now, versus, you know, then thinking, okay, if I had started out that way, would I have been able to, like, build this corporate career and then at 60 or something maybe then move into arts? You know, would that be kind of a different path, obviously, and a very non-typical path, but would that make more sense, right? I mean, I'm thinking now, like, okay, maybe by the time I'm 60, maybe I'll go for a PhD program and become a professor or something like that, right? Like thinking about retiring and thinking of slowing down after a while rather than, kind of ramping up. So I kind of had the opposite feelings in some sense is,
Interesting. I want to drill into that a little bit more. Do you think and I'll use the ugly word for it, regret, of starting off in the arts sector and then moving into the commercial sector limited not just your potential, but maybe your own realization of your own potential?
I think regret is definitely not a word I would use, because decisions are made, right? And I don't regret a single career decision, maybe one, but that wasn't related to the arts.
Good timing.
But no, I think regret is definitely not part of it, and I think it's a thought that I had, right? Like, what if I had not started out there? I think because I started out there, I picked up tremendous value. I picked up tremendous skills. I picked up a lot of things. Now, I think in the stigma point, that might be an interesting kind of segue to, when I was interviewing after being let go from the opera, when I was interviewing, it was really hard to make that case to corporate entities and to commercial entities, right? To really make that case like, no, I got this. I'm not a lesser employee because I started in nonprofits, right? There is that stigma, and it was really, it took a lot to convince folks that. To me, all it means that when you start out in nonprofits, all it means is you definitely have the skills, and actually you probably have more skills because you had to do it with fewer resources typically, right? You don't get the fancy Cadillac Salesforce CRM instance. You get like some really bad, specifically built for the arts instance.
I love how you're being polite and you're not in the field. You can go ahead and name names. It's okay.
I mean, there's things like that, right? Where you really had to build things from scratch, and you had to know how these things worked in spreadsheets because there was no other solution, right? So you actually know how to build these things. You actually know the mechanics behind these things. And that once I kind of figured out that then the case became a lot easier to make to these corporations, saying like, no, I can build this. It's like a carpenter knowing old school skills. They can actually do all the things rather than having learned on fancy machines, right? It's
right. Well, instead of having a CAD-driven router cutter, I mean, you know how to use a hand scraper, and you know how joints are made and why they're designed that way. I think that's actually a really fascinating connection that I'm going to come back to, but I also want to give Ceci a chance to answer that same question from before of the whole stigma aspect and what your experiences were like.
I don't think I experienced any stigma from colleagues in the arts or peers in the arts. My thing was the internal struggle of exactly sort of what you mentioned is, I've dedicated my life to this. I'm an artist, a musician by trade. That's what my degree is in. And I've spent so many years trying to tell arts administrators, yes, you can do this and we can change the industry. And, I was out there fighting the good fight on the, national, international stage, trying to say, we can implement all these things from for-profits, from corporate world to make the arts better. And my big fear and my big struggle was, if I left, would I be leaving before that I could have done that next big thing where I could have really impacted the industry even more? Am I cutting myself off from my potential of working within that industry? Will I lose my identity as a person? What do I do if I'm not, advising arts admins all day about stuff. You know, how is that going to impact sort of my life and how, you know, what my persona is, what my professional persona is. But I mean, all of that stuff, you know, in the past few months, it's, you know, it's cool. Everything's cool. We're good.
Everything's cool. We're good. Well, and
Cool,
you,
anybody. But you know, was that period where it was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And Mark, to your point about trying, you know, to making those connections between the skills at nonprofits and the skills moving into the corporate world, you know, as marketers, the foundational concepts of marketing are the same, no matter what industry. If we're talking the arts, no matter what vertical within the arts, no matter what budget size organization, the fundamental principles are still the same. And I also went through the same kind of thing. I had applied for a number of different jobs over the years that were not in the arts and not in nonprofits. And it, you know, I could tell they're looking at the resume, they're seeing a degree in music and then 15 years of, you know, arts organizations. It's not easy for the average person to make that connection that those skills are there.
Definitely. On that note too, you know, after two jobs in corporate, I came upon an opportunity to apply to an opportunity here in town for the arts, and I did. I got an interview, and strangely enough, I got the exact same question from the arts organization, who are now questioning my credentials in the corporate world as like, well, do you still know what's going on in the arts world? You know, so
because it's changed so much.
right.
Arts are famous for rapid change. So yeah.
Absolutely. Right. That's what they're known for. Yes. Yeah.
And it, you know, you brought up another great point, Ceci, about kind of that identity, and I think the feeling of like, do I, you know, have I given enough, or, you know, is this job, you know, when I leave it, what's going to happen? And I struggled with that, particularly in kind of the first two jobs out of the arts. It was, you know, whether I didn't fully align with a product, or, you know, the heart wasn't necessarily in it. And then the current job, I found that again. And that is super important. And I didn't, after kind of, you know, a couple of kind of failed experiences there, I was really wondering, like, do I need to go back to the arts? Can I find that fulfillment in corporate? And now I have, and it just, you know, it's probably the most important part of your job, is making you feel that you can contribute something of value, making you feel that you have a voice, that you can contribute, and that it's, you know, bringing value to the rest of the world, right? And while, yes, now it's a corporate product, and, you know, it's selling a service to other to e-commerce sellers, it's still, you know, seeing what that product can do and to help others, it is really amazing. So, you know, every corporation will tell you that their product does that, right? They want to make employees feel good. Not every company has that, you know, intrinsically. So being able to find that in a job, I'm here to tell you, it is possible to find that in a job outside of the arts. As passionate as you are about the arts, you can find it elsewhere as well. I'm not here trying to persuade anyone to go one way or another, you know, but it really comes down to, you know, can you provide something of value? How do you feel about the position that you're in? So
that's fantastic. I mean, that kind of that actually segues wonderfully into the next topic in this cycle I want to get through, which is what both sectors can really start to learn from one another. Because there's no shortage of attempts, of nonprofits. If you in the field long enough, you'll hear from a CEO or a board member, well, let's try to do what a real business, a for-profit business does, and that's kind of nonsense. And then on the other side of that coin, you see especially like large for-profit corporations bring in that music paradigm program, where they have an orchestra come in, they see how musicians start to communicate with each other non-verbally on stage, so on and so forth, and all the benefits they get from that. But that all does still seem so relatively artificial. There's more that goes into it. Mark, you've already touched on some of the obvious differences, like budget size. I mean, yes, you don't have the resources inside nonprofit performing arts, and you're stuck with things like spreadsheets and pencil and paper sometimes.
I would say though it's I have always wondered about whether that's mindset over actual budget differences, right?
Interesting.
Because scrappy startup can have just as much of a budget crunch as a nonprofit, right? And other nonprofits can have a sugar daddy that bankrolls tons of stuff and
True.
have no problem there. So the thing that I've found is that there's a difference, I think, in investment, and I think that's kind of maybe the key word is investment. I think generally what I found, again, not applying to every single organization, but generally I think there's a little bit more of a hesitance to invest in things as a nonprofit. That maybe it's the risk, maybe it's the the risk factor there. If we invest in this, does it pay off? Also the funding structure, right? No donor is gonna give money and earmark money specifically for some piece of technology necessarily, right? It's they all want to.
Smart ones do.
Yes, but they all want to say like I'm producing or I'm
Yes.
I'm putting up money so that you can put up this piece of art that I really like, right? And so I think that's to me that's one of the key differences is how they look at investment of specifically technology but also people, I think, as well. Where do you need those resources?
Ceci, jump in on that,
Well,
because you and I have
you-
had some conversations about that, especially with the budget differences and working in commercial and nonprofit. I'm not going to spoil and step on your toes with that, but what do you think?
No, and I think Mark brings up a really excellent point that it's mindset. And, nonprofits always have a chip on their shoulder, whether even budget aside. Oh, well, we're just a nonprofit. Oh, well, we can't do that because of XYZ. Oh, blah, 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 blah. It's very much a mindset sort of thing. And as I've often preached, you can still have nice things even with a smaller budget, as a nonprofit. How you implement something might be slightly different. The scale of something might be slightly different, but you can still do really good things that are built, on a solid foundation at a nonprofit. So what I think about budgets is that, any person, whether they're working in corporate or nonprofit, you have to be able to get the best result with the budget that you have and look at things, take a step back, look at things plainly and figure out the best road forward. One thing though that Mark, that you were saying that I really sort of identified with is the nonprofit sort of lack of having a culture of investing in things. And for me, the first thing that comes to mind is long-term projects, long-term audience development, these sorts of things. I mean, you hear it a little bit more in like fundraising, like where they're nurturing donors and things like this through the planned giving, because every fundraiser wants to get their donors to plan giving. But especially on the marketing side, everything is so hand to mouth. Nonprofits don't give themselves the room to think about the short term and the long term, sort of, and running them concurrently. And because I'm in the marketing space, a lot of times that boils down to, have short-term goals. We need to fill seats for this particular show, and that's absolutely valid. You've got a sales goal that you've got to make, but part of that is also that longer-term plan of engaging audiences, new acquisitions, retention, all that stuff. But I think nonprofits tend to err on that short term, and that's really hurts the organization overall.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate with the investment thing, because I wholeheartedly agree with both of you in the direction that you're going. But from my perspective, I do see nonprofit performing arts organizations allocating a much higher dollar amount into platforms and tools and CRMs and box office suites that they never used to spend money on a decade ago. And now I see groups that are in maybe $2 million budget range spending money on systems that cost $50,000 to $80,000 a year. And a decade ago, that would have been laugh out loud funny ridiculous. So there is that change in investment, but the kind of investment you guys are talking about isn't there. I mean, do you have, Ceci, you look like you're ready to jump on this and devour it from perspective, but I would like to hear what you both think.
Well, I'm gonna go first. Sorry, Mark, because this is a big thing for me. Because not just arts organizations, but a lot of groups, there's always that thing. Well, a new ticketing CRM is going to fix our problems because we've got X, Y, and Z. And so we need a new this, we need a new that, we need a new whatever. Now, that's not to say that arts organizations don't need to have better ticket purchasing and data management solutions, right? From the tech side, of course. Yes, they're the made for the arts ones that Mark mentioned before are still woefully behind what really should be the kind of standard. But anyway, if you're not using all of your channels, if you don't have good messaging, if you don't have a good strategy, it doesn't matter how fancy your CRM is. It doesn't matter how fancy the tech is. And that's one of the things that I think sometimes nonprofits forget. Now, that's not sexy, right? Fancy tech is sexy. Improving base skills and building strategy from the ground up, it's hard work and it's not as sexy, but it's important.
But still an investment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Mark.
Yeah. I mean, so many directions to take that. So many, so many points there.
Take us in the Mark direction.
I think, in terms of investment, one example I always like to bring up, and this was, as a marketing person, having a board member come up with the front page of the art section of the New York Times that had a one-page big ad for the Metropolitan Opera. Why can't we do something like this? Well, there's two possible responses to that. We can if you give us the money. Two, it's the New York Times. We're in Austin. We're not gonna get New York audience. And this is my entire budget for the year. Like there's no way we can do this. So the interesting thing there is I can go on a whole tangent about boards and how that is very different from corporate and nonprofit, right? The whole board involvement, and it's, you have, and I've been a board member myself too, so I've been on both sides of the coin there, so I know how annoying I could be too. But I think, you know, they're looked at for kind of this guidance from a more corporate perspective, and you still get very much a lack of understanding there a lot of times. From my experience, right? Every organization is different, but I think there's still very much a lack of understanding in that relationship with the board and how they see corporate and what they think should be done in the arts, when there's different opinions from the art side. And, you know, kind of managing that, I found, you know, and that there's a lot of differences there in like what you want to invest in. I think there's a lot to unpack there. I took it in a very different direction there, but I think that's definitely been a big difference in my experience, where now, yes, I do have to deal with a lot of different stakeholders still, but it's a very different dynamic than the board dynamic. And maybe I've also been at nonprofit places where I didn't have that board dynamic, because I was lower on the lower on the level. But I think that brings up another kind of difference where maybe we can learn from each other. Is what I found in corporate world is it's a little bit more of a structure and maybe some more guardrails. And while I've had fantastic mentors in the arts as well, I've found that managing people and kind of mentorship has been more prominent, and investment in people has been more prominent with a corporate setting than with a nonprofit setting. Okay. So you know, talking about investment, you know, that's another area I think that I found a pretty big nuance.
Give us one solid, tangible example of investment in people that you just mentioned.
I think so. In my current role,
Sure,
I've been very lucky to have been mentored by great people that provided me with a roadmap for my role and a roadmap for my position and where I can go. I have not experienced that in nonprofit arts organizations. That there was maybe just simply not an investment in time to work with employees on that, right? To build that roadmap for an employee and say, where can you go next? What is your interest in your career? And you know, a lot of the corporate folks that I've worked with even understand that where you go in your career might not involve that company, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, maybe unfairly so, but I think in nonprofits that might have been unheard of, because that's like seen as a betrayal of, you know, why would you even think about going anywhere else, you know? So that's maybe one concrete example where we're in the corporate world. I've had much more of a structural approach to career development, and, you know, where do you need to go? What skills do you need to add? What education do you need to add? What do you need to add to your role to get to that next level? Those conversations were a lot less ambiguous, a lot more clear in a corporate structure, for me at least. Again, I always caveat all of this with, you know, for me and in my experience.
Well, I've had a similar experience in a slightly different way, though. You know, that I feel that in the corporate world, there's much more of a sense of wanting to make sure that the people, the employee, has everything they need. You know, like you mentioned, you know, is there any skills that you need to develop? You know, that could mean like classes or whatever to take, you know, continuing education, learning. You know, how can we support you so that you can do your job the best you can do, you know, and be happy in the position? There's a lot more of that. With nonprofits, you don't see that a lot because it's kind of like, when you're at a nonprofit, you're expected to sacrifice, for the organization and sacrifice yourself, and it doesn't matter, because that's the deal, right?
Seth rings your bonus.
Exactly. But the feeling of, even little things, that kind of feeling of how can we support you? How can we check in? There's actual, I've experienced actual just sort of like check-in calls just to say, hey, like, let's not talk anything about, and of course, every manager is different, but, let's not talk about the tactical stuff. Let's just kind of check in on how you're feeling. Is there something that we can do better? XYZ, which, I've worked with a lot of nonprofits, and I don't think I've come across that kind of approach when it comes to people investment.
What's that cartoon? I've seen it posted on LinkedIn by so many different people. I come across it all the time. It's this like 2-panel cartoon, and it's like, what if we invest in people and they leave? And then the next panel is, what if we don't invest in people and they stay? Right?
I don't think I've seen this.
So
Yeah.
I think that captures that perfectly, right? That to me, that's almost like corporate versus
Well, and the arts admin musical chairs phenomena, right? People just
Yes.
going from the same position. I mean, that is the manifestation of that, because you're going from the same marketing director to marketing director to development director to I mean, it's the same position, just at a different organization. And that's it right there in a nutshell. And I want to make sure that people know, like, and I don't think Marc is either, like, I'm not like bashing arts organizations or nonprofits. I'm saying all of this lovingly because I love them. I spent, my entire career up till now working with them, and I believe in them. I believe in their missions. However, there are some things that do need to change in the industry. This musical chairs thing,
Mm-hmm.
because of how the industry is, that it's same position, different, and it's same shit, different day, right? Same shit, different organization, because of how the industry is as a whole. And that's the stuff that should change and can change, because it is within the power of the organizations and the industry to, really affect that kind of change.
That's excellent. And well, let me ask a couple difficult questions now. I'm going to play double devil's advocate on this one. Let's say money weren't an issue and that a nonprofit organization could offer you the same salary and the same benefits that a corporate job that you're in now can offer. Would you go back?
To me, that's a pretty easy question to answer. And it's a very graduate school answer. It depends.
Such a cop-out.
Well, here's the elaboration on that. I think the main thing, what it comes down to, and I talked about this a few minutes ago, is where am I valued? Not, if compensation is the same, because yes, that is a big factor, to be honest, right? But if that is the same, then I would want to be in a place with a good manager, where I'm valued, where I have clarity, where what my contribution is worth, and where I have a clear path for my career. That's
Okay.
what I would pick. So whoever can offer that, whether it's nonprofit or corporate, they'll have me.
Let me go another step in that direction because I love that answer. And this is something that I work with individuals that are applying for jobs, which is to do their due diligence in looking into an organization. How do you tell that the people who would be your superiors in a nonprofit organization, let's say, would meet that criteria and qualifications? What kind of questions would you walk in and ask in the interview when they ask for reciprocal questions? Marc.
That is a hard question. And I'm not sure if I have the answers to that. I think, there is definitely a due diligence that you need to do. The interview process, whether it's nonprofit or corporate, it's largely the same, right? is not a good process to determine that necessarily, right? You meet them for an hour, 2 hours. You can't judge from that how they're necessarily going to be as a manager or what the culture is. You know, everyone's going to have their kind of canned answers, and I'll be honest, I don't have a good question that I ask to really get to the core of that, or get them like, oh, gotcha, I don't want to work for you, or yes, I do want to work for you. It's you know, it's based on a lot of gut feeling. I've definitely, you know, the best jobs that I've gotten have been through networking and mutual connections, and mutual connections vouching for that person, and, you know, saying, you know, this is how they work, this is what they do. I think, you know, it boils down a lot to the manager that you're going to be working for, right? That's probably 80% of it. And you have to have a good feeling, you have to have a good rapport, you have to have a sense of how they manage. Are they going to be a micromanager? Nobody wants that, right? And there's probably things you can kind of gauge, and, you know, there's Glassdoor, and take that with a grain of salt, you know, those kinds of sites. But I think, you know, if you have a personal connection to this person, kind of get a feeling of what their network is, how they work. That would be the most valuable to me, I think. So, okay. Not a gotcha question. Sorry, I don't have one.
That was a beautiful tap dance. No, but seriously, it was a very good response to that sort of thing, because it isn't an ABC quantitative answer and response. But before I move in another direction, Ceci, I want to know what your response to that would be too.
It depends.
Okay, fine.
Well, I mean, if something magically happened and the entire arts industry and arts admin approach magically changed to be one that is much more forward-thinking, innovative, you know, had a higher risk tolerance, you know, then I probably be slightly more inclined to go back, because I do love it. But, you know, yes, good managers are important, but for me, kind of organizational culture and philosophy is really important. You know, I mean, anybody who has seen me run my mouth at a conference or, you know, a webinar knows that I'm, you know, I've been preaching, you know, we have to move forward. We have to be more innovative. We have to use technology. We have to, you know, not do the things that we've always been doing, right? And being in an environment on the corporate side, which some corporate situations are, you know, are more like that, right? Because it totally depends on the company. But for me, being in a situation where the philosophy is we want to innovate as far as we can go. We are not afraid of failure, fail fast, fail forward, you know, let's just kind of keep going. And how can we make this better, you know, that to me is what really makes me want to get up in the morning and go to work. So if that kind of approach happened in the arts,
I'd love to jump on one thing you said there, Ceci, is culture and philosophy. You know, that's the one thing I think where maybe the nonprofit sector or the arts sector is sometimes not as fake as the corporate sector is in the like company culture. Like, you know, I think with arts organizations, you know where you stand, you know you got to put in your time. You know, they don't beat around the bush, right? It's you know where you stand with that, and it's especially on kind of the like, you know, lower rungs of the employees. It's like, you know, you're all in it together. You go to lunch, event, and, you know, you stick with it together, right? I love that part of it. And I think there's really something to be said about kind of that non-fake work culture at nonprofits. But I've been at corporations where it starts off as, oh, happy and great, and ping pong table and whatever, like, but I've learned, that whenever I see a job description where they say we work hard, we play hard, I run away. Because
It's like,
because I've been at corporations where it started out great, everyone was super happy, everyone was into it, the culture was great, then the results started going down from that company, and the culture went down with it real quick. So this may be not a popular statement, but I am fully convinced that culture follows results, not the other way around. And that's what I've seen in my career, is culture follows results. Results are not necessarily dependent on culture.
I think that is a spectacular observation. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I think it's so interesting, your take that sort of the corporate culture is more fake, whereas I feel that the nonprofit culture is so fake, because in nonprofits everybody's constantly trying to like pad everything and make everything seem like better, and that like all this stuff, there's theatrics, and which I know happen in corporate too, but in a different way, right? And it's almost like in nonprofit, you're pretending there's culture when really everyone is just down in the mines, like trying to like put one foot in front of the other and keep it together, and so that's interesting, that you had that.
I could definitely do without the martyrdom in nonprofit, right? I think that's
while simultaneously singing Disney songs.
It's like you have to be on call all the time, and I've been at corporations where that's the case, but I think the best companies value people's time, and yes, typically that's not necessarily the case at nonprofits and arts organizations, because you do it for the purpose, right?
Right. Well, and here's what we're talking about essentially here, is that maybe it's not so siloed, right? Because you can have a corporate culture that's really bad and really fake. You can have a nonprofit culture that's really bad, really fake, or vice versa. You know what I mean? Some of these things, it crosses that line.
I think it really, what I'm seeing in a lot of this, and my own perspective, is you've both helped articulate what I was kind of hoping the conversation would get to, which it really is. Culture makes a large deal, and it has a large impact on the long-term results. And if there aren't long-term vision, if there's not an investment in people to constantly quantify and measure each of the waypoints to reaching that goal, if there's nothing quantifiable that produces, quote, the profit. On the corporate side, I work in the tech industry increasingly now, and that is the hallmark of what you were describing, Mark, which is that fake, we work hard, play hard kind of culture. It's let's build up and pad our value until somebody buys us, and if they don't, then we're up Schitt's Creek, because then it starts to tank, and then the culture goes down because it all falls apart really fast. And I've lived through 2 tech bubble bursts, and so yeah, that happens. And sadly, I see the same kind of mentality unfold on a decade-long cycle inside the arts field, because of attrition, because of a lack of investment in culture and in long-term vision. But when you look at for-profit companies, especially, again, tech sector I'm thinking of, that focus more on generating a profit as opposed to generating, quote, value. Those are the ones that have a very different approach toward internal culture and toward developing, here's what makes us valuable to employees and vice versa. And that is a hallmark of the differences between some of the frustration and pain points between both cultures of corporate and nonprofit performing arts. So I think this has been just the time we've spent has been a fabulous conversation, just kind of like circling around those primary points. One thing, though, I do want to make sure we touch on before we kind of hang up with this is the opposite side of this review. What are the things that you both know you've brought from the nonprofit world into the corporate world that you know was a decidedly beneficial strength that you probably wouldn't have gotten growing your careers inside a corporate only structure? And crickets.
Well, I can say one of the big things is that having a varied skill set, because in a nonprofit, like I think Mark, you mentioned earlier, you have to do a lot of things. You have to have a lot of skills, and having such a wide range of skills, not only sort of the concepts or the theories of these things, sort of the book knowledge, but actually the tactical knowledge of I can run your Facebook, do Facebook ad campaign, run your Google ads, set up tag manager, make a MailChimp email, do a little bit of CSS if I'm feeling feisty. All of those, having that really widely varied skill set, I think is something that you have to develop working in nonprofits, and not everybody that has been working in corporate that has been on a much more narrow path always has. Also, that ability to manage sort of like multiple projects at one time, which you inherently do at a nonprofit, especially an arts nonprofit, where you're essentially, and from a marketing standpoint, where you're essentially marketing, a slate of different products all at the same time, constantly. The ability to do that, I think, is very valuable.
Yeah, completely agree with all of that. I think I still have some trouble letting some of that go in my current position, where I shouldn't own some of those things, or I shouldn't dabble in some of those things, but I see a solution, so I want to kind of get in there and do it, right? I may have gotten my email send permissions taken away, because I was like, well, I can just do this, I can just do this, this is like marketing emails. I am
emails, so
right?
stealing that.
So I think I think definitely, it brings tons of value, because I can now talk to specific people with those specific roles and talk to them with knowledge, and talk to them in their language, right? Because I've done it. So that's super valuable. And then the other thing I was going to say, and I don't know if this is because nonprofits came first in my career, and then seeing where I am now, the thing I've definitely learned, and is kind of the relationships. I was talking about like board, and working with a board and things like that, and kind of seeing the different stakeholders and communicating with different stakeholders. I've definitely had some really good lessons in the nonprofit world when it comes to that. Just building those relationships and knowing and identifying what those relationships need, and how to put yourself in a good position with some of those folks, right? Because the board can have influence, and and now when I have to present information that I know is going to get seen by a CEO or by a big important partner, those lessons kind of stick with me. So again, I don't know if that's particular to nonprofit versus corporate, but definitely as you kind of grow in your career, those those relationships and the stakeholders, how you communicate to different stakeholders, is definitely something that stick with me.
That's a really good observation. Is yes, to observe and understand the audience that you're speaking to, but that audience is more or less up and larger. And I do see that quite a bit in the corporate world. I know I just hired a new employee, and it was fascinating to see the difference between the people coming in for interviews that had that kind of attitude, regardless of where it was developed, and they understood who they were talking to in the interviews, and the people who were very, this is what I'm trained to do and this is what I do, and I look at those people, and my first instinct and response to all of them was, you would have been a great violinist. You would have been, because that's something else that I think is very unique about the nonprofit performing arts world. Is because one of the major stakeholders are a group of people who are so hyper specialized and hyper trained to degrees that are, surgeon level of amazing, but that is really all they do. And there isn't a lot of overlap outside of that. And the pandemic is another huge conversation. The pandemic has taught a lot of them to start to kind of branch out on the skills they need to begin to learn that they don't have in that. And in tech especially, again, it's interesting to see those parallels. And there's also a lot of, prima donna attitude between the two. That is exactly the same, and it's just ironic and hilarious. But it isn't. And Marc, I think that point is something that might be one of the most valuable things I think we're kind of pulling out of this conversation, which is, you said it so plaintively that I think it might have undersold it a little bit, which is to see that larger picture. Because in an arts organization, regardless if it's a $2 million budget organization or a $100 million budget organization, you recognize and identify with exactly what you just said. And to be able to kind of make that connection and understand that that's what you have to do, is to present and to make that larger connection between all the stakeholders who don't recognize what you do, and to play to that audience, is a really valuable skill. And yeah, I think that's something I see, especially inside corporate industry only employees, that they just really don't develop at all. It's a very Dilbert-esque kind of mentality that is in a negative sense. It keeps them limited.
Yeah. No, I definitely would add to that those learnings came from what I perceive as mistakes or things that I've done that I would now do differently, right? Managing those board relationships, I would do that very differently now. I think, yes, the organization I was with was going through a rough time, but I think looking back, I could have managed things differently on a relationship side, and I was a manager of a team at that point too, and now I am again manager of a team, and seeing, this is almost 10 years ago, so there's a 10-year gap between that, but seeing how I acted then versus now really brings a lot of perspective, right? Like, it's like, oh, I could have done this better for the team, or I could have protected this better for the team, especially as a manager. To me, it's a lot about protecting the team against other stakeholders that may have opinions or may have other ideas, and I think that those guardrails, that's kind of what a manager needs to do. And definitely, again, looking back, learning from mistakes, I feel like that wasn't there sufficiently 10 years ago, and that's what I've learned throughout that. So, and I guess unfortunately the nonprofits had to deal with that, I guess, I learned from that, so I'm happy to have taken that from it, but I guess the nonprofits were in a sense the guinea pig there.
Cece, any thoughts there?
I sort of concur. I was really sort of vibing with what you were saying about, you know, looking back and seeing, how you would do things differently. There's speaking of memes on the internet, there's that one that goes around that's something about, there are people out there who know a different version of you because they knew you 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And inherently, you're not that same person now that you were 10 or 20 years ago. And, with nonprofits, I think because there isn't that sort of safe feeling or a culture of where it's safe to fail or make mistakes, that kind of plays in a lot more. I find that the corporate culture, it's much more, you say, okay, well, we made this mistake, and so let's just learn and move on. Whereas it's a much different type of thing in a nonprofit. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is not really making any sense, and I'm going around in circles because
Oh no, it makes complete sense. It makes complete sense because I want to follow up with that with a very specific question, which is kind of humorous but not. So which one? I'll give this to Cece first, and I'm going to try to translate it into Marc, into his geek speak. But I'll start with Cece because I already know your geek speak, which is, which one's the mirror universe?
The mirror universe. Well, the mirror universe is nonprofits.
Okay, there. And see, that was an obvious answer to you. And Marc, I know you're not go ahead.
Although, if nonprofits were the mirror universe, I would have had like super shiny clothing all the time and like straight hair, and everyone would have goatees.
And you've killed at least 3 people during this interview.
Yes. With a sword.
With a sword. Some sort of edged blade.
With bat left.
Well, there you go. Star Trek. And Marc, and I know you're nowhere near a Star Trek kind of person, although you have a rocket behind you.
I do, yes. That turn 30-something and still get Legos for my birthday, right?
There we go. Well, they're so much better than they used to be. But you're a Lord of the Rings guy, so I figure, is this like wearing the ring or without the ring?
Nice one.
Which one's which?
Nice one.
Thank you.
Oh, man.
I don't know what any of this means.
I would say wearing the ring is the nonprofit world, but not because that's when you enter the dark world of Sauron and all of that, right? It's probably because that's where you're invisible, from the outside world.
From the outside world, yes.
Nobody in the outside world can see you, and in the meantime, you're struggling in this crazy dark world. That sounds a lot worse than it is. That's not necessarily how I saw my time at nonprofits, of course, but I think that's where I would put that, I guess. I think it's much more about how others perceive you, and not knowing what you kind of go through in a nonprofit. That's probably the link there.
Were our answers the same? Because I don't understand the ring thing.
They were, but very different. And I'll add to Marc's answer there. There were plenty of heroes that wore the ring.
Yes.
They weren't all bad guys, clearly. But I think that ideal of working in the nonprofit of wearing the ring makes you invisible to everyone else around you, I think is that, I wasn't even thinking of that, but that was absolutely brilliant.
Well, and let's put it this way: if wearing the ring signifies working at a nonprofit, not just anyone can do it, right? So
and there you go as well too.
So I mean, I want to make sure that we end this on a positive note.
Absolutely.
I mean, the admiration for people who work in nonprofits is abundant. I think that they're fighting a good fight, and they're bringing that ring to Mount Doom.
Absolutely, for the right purposes. Yeah, and on the other side of that, in the mirror universe analogy, which is people in the mirror universe don't see themselves as the mirror universe. Too, they're doing what they're doing because they know that's what they should be doing, and so it's very much the same thing. If we had like a third guest here, I could throw a Star Wars reference out as well too. We cover at least every major, realm of the geekdom, but
I'd have to get my wife for that.
Yeah, I don't understand any of that either.
I would like to thank my guest for taking the time and speaking some truths and talking about stuff that isn't always comfortable, but doing it from just a place of retrospection and love for both sides of what they do. And also two people I have an enormous amount of respect for. If there was any two people I could think of to do this show besides these two, we wouldn't be doing this show. It really is that simple. So thank you, Ceci. Thank you, Marc, very much for being here. And if there's anything else you would like to say before we kind of shut things down, now would be the time to say it.
I just want to say thank you. I mean, to be able to talk with you two again is just fantastic. I love our conversations, whether on camera or off. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, all those working in the arts, we are rooting for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it was really great to have the band back together.
And thank you, everyone. And then we'll shut it down there. Bye-bye.
So what nonprofits aren't good at, or, don't give... did I freeze again?
You did. Sorry.
And here's the key point.
Somebody screenshot me if I make a really great face when I'm frozen.